She flinched when the boots stopped outside the tent. Leather creaked, spurs jingled. The American soldiers were here. They'll laugh, she thought, or worse. The other women sat still, shoulders locked with fear. The girls, some barely 17, had learned not to cry. They had been used, discarded, labeled as shame incarnate by their own country. Comfort women, the Empire called them. Their pasts marked them, their futures erased. But then the tent flap lifted, and the men who stepped inside didn't leer. They removed their hats. One even tipped his like a gentleman in an old Western movie. Another knelt to offer her a blanket. Not a command, a gesture. Behind him, coffee, stew, a harmonica. And a voice said softly, "You're safe now, ma'am." They weren't guards, they weren't predators, they were cowboys. American, yes, but not monsters. In that moment, something broke, something deeper than fear. And something else, just as powerful, began to take its place. The boots that had once thundered across battlefields now moved in steady, almost reluctant rhythm through the dirt roads of Manchuria and Okinawa. The war had ended, but for the women in the back of the convoy, labeled comfort girls by the system that had consumed them, nothing felt over. Their uniforms, if they could be called that, hung loose over thin shoulders. Some wore mismatched shoes. Others had bloodied bandages that hadn't been changed in days. A few limped, but no one complained. They had learned long ago that silence was safer. With each mile they waited for the cruelty to begin. They had been told stories, horrors, really, that the Americans, the beasts, their officers called them, would punish them for the enemy's crimes. That surrender meant degradation, not mercy. That the enemy would see them as nothing but used goods and treat them accordingly. They had seen the fate of other prisoners, men who had been shot in fields, civilians who had simply disappeared. For women like them, marked by a past they had no control over, the threat felt inevitable. One girl, no more than 16, whispered a prayer into her sleeve. Another clutched a talisman of rice paper, long faded and nearly torn in half. They walked without knowing where they were being taken, but they all believed they knew what would happen when they arrived. The truck stopped at the edge of a camp, one that looked strangely clean. There were wooden barracks with slanted tin roofs, laundry lines swaying in the breeze, even a small fenced-in garden near the center. But the women were not distracted by scenery. They braced. When the tailgate dropped, they did not scramble out. They waited. Heads bowed, arms folded, ready. And then came the voices, not in Japanese, but not balked either. Slow, southern-tinted English, low and gentle. A man stepped forward, tall, thin, dusty boots, and yes, the wide-brimmed hat like in the movie posters they'd once seen in a black market cinema. He didn't reach for a weapon. He removed his hat. Behind him, others did the same. The women stared, confused. One of the soldiers, older than the rest, squinted in the sunlight and pulled a harmonica from his pocket. He began to play, a low, lazy tune that floated through the afternoon like smoke. It wasn't a command or a warning. It was music, unthreatening, familiar almost. Another man approached slowly. He offered something, a wool blanket folded neatly. His hands were steady, and he didn't try to touch her. He just held it out like an offering. She didn't move at first. She couldn't. It felt like a trap, a test. But he just waited. And when she finally reached out, the fabric was real, warm, clean. There were no whips, no leers, no balked insults, just a strange, quiet efficiency. They were led to a barrack where beds with real mattresses waited, blankets tucked in tight, pillowcases pressed. Some of the women looked around, blinking. One whispered, "Is this for us?" Another muttered, "This is a trick." But when the guards returned with trays, real trays, with bowls of steaming soup and bread, the questions faded into confusion. What was this place? The Cowboys, as they would come to call them, didn't seem like conquerors. They moved with relaxed discipline, their rifles slung lazily, their speech more drawl than threat. One of them, barely older than the women themselves, tried to say something in broken Japanese. They didn't understand the words, but they recognized the tone. It wasn't dominance, it was kindness. Later that night, long after the sun dipped below the wire fence, the women lay awake on their beds, blankets pulled to their chins. The stars above were the same as the ones they had known in other camps, other places, but the silence was not. No screams, no boots, only the soft thrum of a harmonica somewhere near the kitchen and the low murmur of American voices telling stories they couldn't yet understand. And still, none of them believed it would last, because nothing ever did, not for them, not the promises, not the protection, not the idea that they were anything more than bodies to be used and discarded. Before the war ended, before the boots stopped marching, these women had lived in places where kindness did not exist. It had been scrubbed out of them, same as their names. In the comfort stations, they weren't girls or women. They were numbers on a chart, functions of morale, tools of the empire. The military kept ledgers, times, dates, totals. Men passed through like weather, rough, impatient, silent. The women were told this was duty, that their bodies were necessary, that Japan needed them. No one ever asked what they needed. Many were forced through deception, promised jobs in factories, clerical work, training. They arrived to find rooms with paper-thin walls and a queue of soldiers outside. Escape was impossible. To speak out was treason. Their identities were buried beneath ink stamps and locked doors. Some resisted at first, some screamed, some clawed. But over time, something worse than pain set in. Resignation. Their names faded, their language hardened. They learned to move without emotion. Some stopped dreaming altogether. The women who had once looked at their reflections now avoided mirrors. They were ashamed, yes, but more than that, they were absent, emptied. One girl, Mariko, used to count the cracks in the ceiling while it happened. Another, Yuki, bit the inside of her cheek until she bled, just to feel something real. For many, the worst part wasn't the violation. It was the silence that followed, the expectation that they would clean themselves, dress, and do it again. Day after day, year after year, they weren't allowed to cry. Crying suggested you thought your pain mattered, and in those places it didn't. So when the war ended, they didn't cheer. They didn't even feel relief. What freedom was left for women already erased? Now, in this strange new camp under the care of foreign soldiers, something even more terrifying arrived: visibility. When the Americans looked at them, they didn't see shame. They saw people. It began with small, disarming things. A towel, for example, soft, white, folded, a thing that was not rationed, not demanded. It was offered. One woman hesitated to touch it. When she did, she held it like contraband. Another was given a pair of slippers, still warm from the sun. She stared at them for a long time before slipping them on, her breath catching as though they might vanish. And then there were the stares, not the hungry, empty ones from the soldiers in the comfort stations, but glances that felt almost embarrassed. The Americans looked, yes, but they didn't leer. One guard, no older than 20, saw a girl struggling to carry a bucket of water. He didn't grab it from her. He just nodded and walked beside her. Silent, present, a witness, not a threat. That shook her more than any punishment ever had. These gestures, so ordinary for the men who offered them, were almost violent in their impact. They cracked open walls the women had spent years building. In their world, decency was a foreign language. Here, it was spoken in gestures instead of words. A clean blanket, a cup of coffee, a look that said, "You are not invisible." But nothing confused them more than the absence of cruelty, the missing slap, the silence where derision should have been. They found themselves waiting for the blow that never came. Some stayed rigid, eating without tasting, walking without relaxing. Others, slowly, let their shoulders drop. One woman laughed once, quietly, involuntarily, when she saw an American trip on his own bootlace. She clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, but no one punished her. No one even looked, and in that moment her shame cracked. Not vanished, not healed, but cracked just enough for light to slip in. The next morning, the smell came first. It drifted through the slats of the barracks, low and rich and unfamiliar, fat and salt, something warm and slow-cooked. Some women stirred, confused. Others sat up sharply, panic briefly flickering behind their eyes. For years, hunger had been more than an ache. It had been a way of life, a structure. Their bodies had adapted to starvation like a language, learning to move on little, to accept pain without protest. The idea of abundance was not just foreign, it was dangerous. When they were called to eat, the line formed slowly. Hesitant steps, eyes darting. They half expected to be mocked for their hunger, made to beg, but instead trays were placed in their hands, metal, weighty, and onto those trays fell ladles of beef stew, thick with carrots and potatoes, the scent so heavy it made the air itself feel edible. Slices of soft bread followed, warm and pillowy, and at the end of the line something wrapped in silver foil, a piece of chocolate. Some stared. One woman blinked at it as if it might explode. A few stepped away, refusing to eat, not out of protest but defense. Because this was a trap. It had to be. Food like this was too much, too fast. Their commanders had told them the Americans would humiliate them, feed them scraps, treat them like animals. And now here they were, being offered meals with more calories than they'd consumed in a week. One woman tucked her bread into her sleeve. Another held the chocolate under her tongue without biting, convinced it might be laced with something. But the hunger was stronger than fear. When Mariko finally tasted the stew, the salt hit her first, then the warmth, then the softness of a carrot on her tongue. Her jaw trembled as she chewed. Her throat tightened, not just with the effort of swallowing, but with something else, grief. Because this wasn't just food, it was an insult to everything she had come to believe about herself. That she was unworthy, that her suffering was deserved, that her body existed only to endure. And here, for no reason she could understand, she was being fed like she mattered. Yuki unwrapped her chocolate with shaking fingers. She didn't eat it. She just stared at it for a long time. It reminded her of something, maybe a New Year's gift from her childhood, or the luxury ads pasted onto Tokyo shop windows before the war. When she finally took a bite, it stuck to her teeth and coated her tongue in sweetness so thick it hurt. She cried silently. Later that afternoon, the Americans brought something else, peanut butter. They offered it in small metal cups, each paired with crackers. The women recoiled. The smell was strange. One dipped a cautious finger in, sniffed, and then licked. Her face twisted. She gagged, spat it out, and then, to everyone's surprise, burst into laughter. Real laughter. Others began to laugh too, half in shock, half in relief. It was absurd, this thick brown paste, the way it clung to the roof of the mouth. One woman said it tasted like mud. Another said it was a trick. But the guards just grinned and shrugged as if to say, "We think it's terrible too, sometimes." That moment changed something. Not because the food was good, but because the laughter was allowed. Expected, even. No one was punished for making a face. No one was hit for rejecting it. And in that small, ridiculous moment, sticky fingers, scrunched noses, quiet giggles, they weren't comfort women or prisoners or tools of an empire. They were human, together. And later, as they lay on their bunks, full in a way that was almost frightening, the question none of them dared ask began to whisper inside them like steam rising from soup. What if I matter? It was a question too big to say aloud, too dangerous to trust. But it lingered, soft as the smell of stew that clung to their clothes, as real as the crumbs left on their trays. The women had expected cruelty to follow them like a shadow. Instead, they were met with something far stranger. Familiar faces in unfamiliar uniforms. Boys, really. Some with freckles and sunburned necks. Some with boots too large and hats that drooped low over their eyes. They called them Cowboys, not just because of the hats, but because they felt like something out of an old dream, men from a world where gallantry wasn't a myth. They came from places the women had never heard of, Kansas, Texas, Missouri. Their Japanese was poor or non-existent, but their tone said more than their words. They didn't shout, they didn't point. They offered things, quietly, awkwardly. A folded handkerchief, a book, a slice of something sweet wrapped in wax paper. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the work was done, they played music. The harmonica was the first instrument they heard. One of the guards, tall, with a crooked smile and hair the color of wheat, sat on an overturned crate outside the mess hall one evening and began to play. The sound drifted into the barracks like a breeze. It wasn't precise or practiced. The notes stumbled, bent, sometimes faded, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. One woman sat up in her bunk, stunned. Another crept toward the window, drawn by the sound. They didn't understand the song, but they understood the feeling. Nostalgia, gentleness, something homesick and tender. In their world, music had always served a purpose. Marching songs, national anthems, war cries, nothing frivolous, nothing soft. Here, music was just music, a sound made not to command, but to comfort. One night, a woman whispered, "He's playing for himself," and somehow that made it more powerful. Days passed. The Cowboys kept surprising them. One tried to teach a few girls how to say hello in English. "Hi," he said, tapping his chest, smiling wide. "Joe." The women looked at each other, wary. Then one mimicked him. "Hi, Joe." He laughed, not at her, but with her. Another tried, then another. The word was light on their tongues, disarming. A few days later, one of them scribbled "thank you" on a piece of napkin. She didn't say it out loud, not yet, but she handed it to a soldier who had fixed the hinge on the latrine door. He read it, touched the brim of his hat, and walked away without a word. Respect, it turned out, didn't need translation. Other soldiers gave gifts, small, odd things, a pair of wool socks, a harmonica left behind on a stool, a packet of flower seeds. One girl found a sketchbook placed on her cot, the first page already filled with a drawing of the camp gate, and beside it, a note. "For your drawings, I heard you used to paint." She hadn't picked up a pencil in years. Her hands trembled when she did. Curiosity crept in like light through a torn curtain. Not just about the Americans, but about themselves. Who had they been before the camps? Before the comfort stations? Before the silence swallowed them whole? One night the harmonica returned, This time, a different tune. Slower, almost mournful. The women didn't speak. They just listened. The notes rose like smoke, settled like dust. And for a few minutes, nothing else existed. No past, no orders, no shame. Only music in the dark, played by a cowboy who didn't know their names, but gave them something they hadn't felt in years. Stillness. And in that stillness, they began to wonder, not just if they mattered, but why no one had ever told them they did. The next morning, a soldier with round glasses and a clipped accent approached the barracks with a small crate under his arm. He spoke slowly, clearly, as if every syllable needed to be handled with care. Inside the crate were pencils, short, worn, erasers mostly rubbed down to the metal. Beneath them, stacks of paper, cream-colored and smelling faintly of cardboard. No fanfare, no command, just an offer. Write home, if you want to. The women stared as if he'd handed them weapons. Letters? To home? The very idea felt impossible. For years they'd been told they no longer had homes, that their shame had exiled them, that if they ever returned, they would bring dishonor with them like a plague. In the comfort stations, even mail from family had been forbidden. Their silence had been mandatory. To speak, to admit they were alive, to acknowledge what had been done to them, was betrayal. And now, here, a stranger was asking them to break that silence with ink. One woman reached for a pencil, then stopped. Her fingers hovered above the box, trembling. The others waited, watching. No one moved. But later, when no one was looking, she returned. She sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the barrack wall, paper balanced on her knees. The pencil felt alien in her hand. Her first strokes were faint, the kanji uneven. Her name, her real name, looked strange on the page. She hadn't written it in years, not since the night she'd boarded the train that took her to the front. "Mother," she began, "I am alive." She paused. What came next? Could she tell the truth? That the Americans were feeding her? That they hadn't hurt her? That they had given her slippers, let her sleep in silence, offered her music instead of fists? Would her mother believe her? Or worse, would she not want to? Another woman wrote nothing at all. She stared at the paper for hours, folded it, and placed it beneath her mattress like a relic. For her, the act of not writing was louder than any message. It was defiance, a protest against the silence she had been forced to live inside. Others began to try, slowly, tentatively. One letter simply read, "I am not dead." Another said, "The sky here is blue, the food is warm, and I have not been beaten." Some drew tiny pictures in the margins, flowers, birds, half-remembered faces. The guards never read the letters. They just handed them to someone in a jeep, who drove off with them in a leather pouch marked Tokyo. What happened next? None of the women knew. But in rooms across Japan, some mothers began to cry over envelopes they had never expected to see. Some fathers sat frozen, hands clenched, rereading a single sentence over and over. Brothers read them aloud in the quiet of night. And perhaps somewhere in the shadowed corridors of what remained of the military regime, a censor flipped through letter after letter, waiting for insults or betrayal, and instead finding something even more dangerous: kindness. The letters didn't just travel across oceans, they punctured illusions, because the American soldiers weren't raping these women. They weren't mocking them. They were letting them speak, letting them be people. And that was more devastating to the Japanese propaganda machine than any bullet. In the weeks that followed, more letters were written. Some were sent, some were hidden. Some were buried under floorboards like time capsules meant for a future no one could yet imagine. But every letter, sent or not, carried the same fragile truth on its surface. I exist. I endured. I still have a voice. And for the first time in years, that voice wasn't asking for permission. The days began to pass with rhythm. Not routine, exactly, but something softer, something that didn't threaten. Morning light filtered through the wooden slats of the barracks. The sound of boots still echoed in the distance, but it was no longer a sound of dread. It was simply the guards making their rounds. There were chores, of course, and inspections, but in between came something the women had never known in captivity: time, and with time came questions they didn't yet have answers for. One morning, a new item appeared on their bunks: small canvas rolls tied with fraying string. Inside, sewing needles, thread of all colors, small scissors dulled from use. No explanation, no demands, just sewing kits. Some stared at them like they were traps. Others unrolled them with trembling fingers, touched the needles as if confirming they were real. Mariko sat in the corner of the barracks and began mending a tear in her sleeve. Her fingers remembered more than she did. She used to sew before the war. Not just hems, but patterns, embroidery, things that made clothing beautiful, not just functional. As the needle moved in and out of the cloth, something shifted inside her, a quiet clarity. She wasn't fixing government-issued linen anymore. She was reclaiming something, herself. Other women joined her. They formed loose circles in the sun, bent over fabric scraps. They shared colors, taught each other stitches, laughed quietly when someone pricked a finger. No one said what they were really doing: healing. Stitch by stitch, thread by thread. Not just garments, but memory, identity. It was a rebellion disguised as domesticity. But it wasn't just thread being offered. One of the older women, Keiko, had spent years squinting at faces, guessing expressions, living in a permanent blur. She never spoke of it. She just accepted the world as a smear. But then a soldier, tall, polite, always bringing extra trays to the kitchen, placed something gently on her bunk. A box. Inside, a pair of spectacles, round and delicate. When she put them on, her breath caught. The room came into focus. She saw lines in the wood, dust floating in sunlight, tears in her friend's sleeve that she hadn't noticed before. She wept. No one, the soldier had said awkwardly in English, should live in a blur. He didn't mean it as a metaphor, but she understood it that way. These small acts, mending, seeing, sitting still, should not have been revolutionary, but they were. Because they didn't just challenge the physical scars, they tore at something deeper. If the enemy is the one helping me heal, then who abandoned me in the first place? The answer was too painful to say aloud. Their own country had sent them to rot. It had lied. It had erased them. It had made them ashamed of their suffering. But here, in a foreign camp, they were being fed, clothed, treated, not coddled, not pitied, simply cared for. And that, more than any weapon or speech, shattered the myths they'd been raised to believe. One girl embroidered a flower into her collar. Another stitched her name into the inside of her blouse, something she hadn't dared to claim for years. A third fashioned a patchwork cloth doll out of leftover rags and placed it on her bunk. When someone asked her who it was for, she said, "Me." They still didn't trust it fully. How could they? Trust had been weaponized before, but each new day without cruelty made the past harder to justify. The Americans hadn't asked them to forget. They hadn't demanded forgiveness. They just handed them needles, thread, and vision, and let them begin again. And for women who had once been erased, beginning was the most dangerous act of all. It was a cloudy afternoon when Yuki borrowed the mirror from the infirmary. "Just for a moment," she said. "Just to check a toothache," she claimed. But when the nurse handed it to her, a small square piece with a crack through one corner. Her hands shook. She hadn't looked at herself in over 3 years. She took it back to the barracks, turned away from the others, and held it up slowly. She braced for what she'd see. A ghost, a used-up vessel, a girl whose youth had been chewed through and spat out. But the face staring back wasn't quite that. The cheekbones were sharper, the eyes older, but they still held a glimmer, one that startled her. She blinked. Her reflection blinked back. She tilted her head, ran her fingers over her hair, noticed the gray at her temples, but also the soft curve of her jaw. The faintest memory of the girl she used to be. It wasn't beauty she found. It was existence. That night, others asked to see it. One by one, women sat on the edge of the cot, holding the mirror with both hands like it might slip through their fingers. Some laughed, short and surprised. Others cried. One whispered, "I thought I'd be uglier." Another said nothing, only touched her lips, then her neck, then let out a long, shaky breath. What began as a private ritual became something communal, a reckoning. They passed the mirror around in silence, taking turns not just seeing, but being seen. And afterward, in the stillness of their beds, came the talk. Quiet, raw, vulnerable. Conversations drifted through the dark like confessions. Mariko admitted she'd forgotten the sound of her own laugh. Keiko said she used to sing while she sewed, long before the war. One younger girl, barely 20, asked, "Do you think it was our fault?" The room went quiet. Then someone whispered, "No, but I thought it was, too." Shame doesn't need chains. It lives in the mind. And the Empire had done its job well. It had trained these women to believe their suffering was a debt they owed. But the mirror shattered that lie. Because for the first time, they saw something the military had never allowed. A woman with a name, a face, and a future. In the days that followed, something shifted in the way they carried themselves. Shoulders squared, eyes met. A few started brushing their hair. Others asked for soap, combs, ribbon. Not for vanity, for dignity. When one woman tore her dress on a nail, she didn't hide it. She mended it with red thread, bold and visible. And the questions kept coming. Not shouted, not debated, just gently asked in quiet corners. If the Americans think we matter, why didn't our own people? If they offer us warmth without shame, why were we taught that kindness is weakness? Why were we treated like trash by those who called us sisters of the nation? These were not political questions. They were personal earthquakes. Each act of care, each mirror glance, each letter, each bowl of stew was a wedge, cracking open the old myths, the myth that they had no worth, the myth that they were only what was done to them. And as those myths crumbled, something else rose, a fragile, flickering sense of self. The Americans weren't saints. They didn't save the women, but they saw them. And sometimes being seen is the beginning of salvation. So they kept the mirror, taped the crack, shared it, not because it made them pretty, but because it made them real. The next gift wasn't clothing or food. It came with chalk dust, the scent of old paper, and a sound the women had nearly forgotten. Laughter from the belly of a man reading out loud. A classroom had been cleared out in one of the old storage barracks, its windows patched with mismatched glass, its door hanging just slightly askew. Inside were folding chairs, a blackboard, and a soldier with a drawl who tapped the board with a ruler and said, "We're going to start with the alphabet." The women blinked at him, uncertain. English? Here? No one forced them to go, but curiosity did what commands could not. One by one they filed in. Some sat in the back, arms crossed. Others leaned forward, furrowing their brows as letters formed unfamiliar shapes on the board. A, B, C. The sounds were strange, but the rhythm was soothing, like learning to walk again. They were prisoners, technically, but for the hours spent in that room, they were students. Books began arriving. Not textbooks, novels, fiction. One woman received Huckleberry Finn. She couldn't read it yet, not fully, but she traced the letters with her fingers like Braille. Someone else was given a volume of Emily Dickinson. Another, a copy of The Secret Garden. It was literature chosen not for doctrine, but for discovery. And then came the records. A corporal from Chicago wheeled in a gramophone one afternoon, grinning like a magician about to reveal his best trick. He dropped the needle, and for the first time, they heard jazz. Real jazz. Saxophones that howled, drums that rumbled like heartbeats. Ella Fitzgerald's voice curled through the air like smoke. The women sat stunned. This was not war music. It wasn't patriotic. It wasn't militarized. It was playful, rebellious, free. Some tapped their feet before they realized it. Others swayed gently, eyes closed. That night, one woman whispered, "I didn't know music could smile." But not everyone welcomed it. Education was dangerous, not because the Americans were indoctrinating them, but because every word they learned peeled back another layer of the lies they'd lived under. The Empire had told them freedom was a Western poison, that foreign ideas would corrupt them, that obedience was honor, and knowledge outside Japan was treason. And yet here they were, learning grammar drills while chewing on peanut butter crackers, giggling when they mispronounced Thursday, swapping books beneath blankets like contraband. Treason had never felt so tender. Still, guilt lingered. A woman named Aya stopped attending class after the second week. She sat alone near the latrines, clutching the worn notebook the soldiers had given her. "I feel like I'm betraying my father," she said to no one in particular. "He died for the emperor, and I'm here, writing nouns." Another woman sat beside her, said nothing, then slowly tore a page from her own notebook, handed it over. On it, she'd written a single sentence. "I want to live." Aya didn't speak, but the next day she returned to class. These were not grand rebellions. There were no speeches, no flags burned, just syllables whispered like secrets, just sentences built like bridges, just songs hummed under breath when no one was watching. And maybe that's what made it revolutionary. They weren't forgetting who they were. They were remembering who they'd never been allowed to become. And in that makeshift classroom, surrounded by barbed wire and bad chalk, they weren't comfort women. They weren't prisoners. They were learners, thinkers, beings in motion, and maybe, for the first time ever, free. If you're finding this story as powerful as we are, give this video a like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The harbor smelled of rust and salt when the trucks rolled in before dawn, their engines coughing into the quiet. The women sat shoulder to shoulder in the back, clutching cloth bundles tied with bits of twine. Some held their belongings close, others held them like they were holding their breath. The war was over. Papers had been signed, flags lowered, commands rescinded. And now the Americans, those strange, gentle cowboys who had given them food and books and mirrors, were sending them back across the sea. Back to Japan, back to the place that had abandoned them. A soldier helped them off the truck one by one, his gloved hand hovering respectfully near their elbows, but never gripping. Another stood by the gangway, calling out names with the careful pronunciation of a man who did not want to misstep. The women climbed onto the ship, each step heavier than the last. Some paused at the top, turning to look at the camp. its wooden fences, its laundry lines, the barracks where they had rediscovered pieces of themselves. And then they turned toward the ocean. The Pacific stretched out like a vast, trembling mirror. Somewhere beyond it, Japan waited. But which Japan? The home of their childhoods, of tatami mats, steaming rice, summer cicadas, or the Japan that had devoured them, erased them, fed them to the machinery of war without hesitation? They didn't know. That was the terror. As the ship groaned to life and drifted away from the pier, the coastline blurred, then thinned, then vanished altogether. The women stood at the railing, the wind slicing through their hair. A few cried. Others stared straight ahead, fists clenched at their sides. Mariko held the bundle on her lap, a blanket the Americans had given her, a book of English phrases, a sewing kit, and the cracked mirror wrapped carefully inside. A fragile proof that she had once been treated like she mattered. On the first night, the sea was calm. The women lay in bunks, stacked 3 high, the ship rocking them like a cradle. But sleep did not come easily. Some whispered into the darkness, wondering what their parents would say. Would their families open their doors? Would their communities spit on them? Would their names be spoken again or buried deeper? A girl named Hana confessed, her voice trembling, "What if they pretend I never existed?" No one answered. They didn't need to. The silence itself was a shared fear. Days bled into each other. The ocean stretched forever, an endless expanse between the selves they had been and the selves they had become. They paced the deck, clutching railings when the waves grew tall. They spoke of small things, food, music, the shape of English letters, because the large things were too heavy to voice. Yet underneath every conversation lurked the same unspoken truth. They were returning not as survivors, but as secrets. The Americans had given them permission to breathe. Japan might take that breath back. One afternoon, the women gathered, on the deck with their bundles. One by one, they opened them. Not to discard anything, but to hold each item again. A blanket, a notebook, a pair of spectacles, a harmonica someone had slipped into a pocket. These were objects, yes, but also reminders that somewhere in the world, people they had been trained to fear had treated them with dignity. Yuki lifted her mirror, tilting it toward the sun. The crack glittered like lightning. She didn't look at her reflection this time. She looked at the light bending across its surface. "When we arrive," she said softly, "they will see only what they want to see." "But we," Mariko replied, touching the red thread stitched into her collar, "will know who we are." The ship creaked. The ocean sighed, and the horizon stayed painfully empty. Peace, they realized, was not the end of suffering. It was its own kind of uncertainty, and as the ship pressed onward toward Japan's broken shores, the women stood shoulder to shoulder at the bow, their hair whipping in the wind, bracing not for an enemy, but for home. The docks of Yokohama were not welcoming. There were no crowds, no embraces, only uniformed officials, a few Red Cross nurses, and the heavy silence of a country unsure what to do with its returned daughters. The women stepped onto land with the cautious gait of those not quite sure they belonged to it anymore. The air was familiar but thinner somehow, like something essential had been drained from it. Bombed-out neighborhoods, twisted metal, and crumbling shrines reminded them that the Japan they had known was gone. And yet, what awaited them in its place was somehow worse. No one asked where they had been. No one wanted to know. They were told to be grateful, told to move on, told not to speak. The shame came roaring back, not from within, but from around them. Neighbors averted their eyes. Families spoke in hushed tones. Some were refused entry into their childhood homes. Others were told simply, "Don't talk about it." ever. And so silence settled again, like dust on a ruin. But this silence was different, because now, buried beneath it, lived memory. Mariko unpacked her cloth bundle in the corner of her cousin's home. She smoothed out the American blanket, opened the small mirror, reached for the harmonica, still dented, still tuned. Each item felt like a seed she had smuggled in from another world, a proof not of what she had suffered, but of what she had survived. She didn't speak of the soldiers who had brought her soup and taught her thank you. She didn't describe the jazz or the books or the sewing circle in the sun. Not aloud, but she remembered. And that memory had weight. They all remembered. Some women met in secret under the guise of tea gatherings or temple visits. They didn't talk about everything, not yet. But one would pull a worn English book from her purse, and another would whisper a new word she had learned. A few even brought notebooks, their covers decorated with thread or stickers, and slowly, cautiously, they began to breathe again. The world around them wanted the old version back, mute, obedient, ashamed. But once you have tasted dignity, it cannot be untasted. The kindness of those American cowboys, those boys barely older than them, who offered harmonicas and helped them find their names again, lingered, not as saviors, but as witnesses. And in their witnessing, a door had opened. A new possibility had been born. Keiko, now living alone in a borrowed room, kept her sewing kit on the windowsill. She stitched not because she had to, but because it reminded her she could. Aya, who once felt treasonous for learning English, began teaching it quietly to a neighborhood boy, exchanging lessons for rice. Yuki wrote poetry in a mix of Japanese and broken English, never sharing it, but filling notebook after notebook as if reclaiming her voice one syllable at a time. None of them became famous. Their stories weren't entered into history books. But somewhere, in the deep folds of memory, they carried the truth. They had mattered once. And once was enough to light a spark, because even if the world refused to see them again, they had seen themselves in mirrors, in language, in letters home, in peanut butter sandwiches and late-night jazz. And that, despite everything, could not be undone. If this story moved you, like the video, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from.